Hi, you guys. It's Congresswoman CASTOR. Sorry about that technical difficulty. My remarks were very enthralling and farsighted, just depending on if you missed a little bit of it. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today as we tackle the climate crisis. We have on this stream some of the most outstanding national leaders who are serving in the Congress that understand the intersection between environmental injustice, public health, and the solutions we need to bring to bear on a national basis to lift up families and communities all across the country. We have these solutions. These members are smart and they are focused and they are informed. They have committed their professional lives to lifting up communities of color all across this country with tangible solutions to improve their health and to protect, to make sure that our kids have every opportunity to succeed in life. We, just a few months ago, House Democrats rolled out a very expansive and sweeping, ambitious climate action plan that focuses on how we improve the public health, clean up the air we breathe, the water we drink, and ensure that the public health is at the forefront. I'm going to throw it to Rep. MCEACHIN because he has been probably one of the most prominent leaders in the country when it comes to environmental justice. Don, thanks for joining us today, and take it away.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you today. And if I can just say a word of thanks to you, Madam Chair, for your hard work and diligence as Chair of the Climate Crisis, the Special Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. You know, I'm convinced that when the history of this time period is written, your name will figure prominently because you were tireless in your efforts to get us to the point where we could roll out that report that you just spoke to. Over 500 pages that act as a guideline, a roadmap, if you will, for where we need to go on this very important issue, the issue of the 21st century. And while there are certainly the committees of jurisdiction will take that report and work their will on that report, I predict that it will survive and intact. And again, that your name will figure prominently in the history of this time period. Thank you. I have had a wonderful opportunity to work with Chairman Rahul Grahava. He's the chair of the Natural Resources Committee, and together he and I worked up a bill that we call Environmental Justice for All. And how do we go about doing it? Because, you know, so oftentimes Washington will turn to communities across this nation and say, hey, we're going to tell you what it is that you need and what to do. But we didn't take that approach. We understood that environmental justice communities, and we probably ought to define that first, those are communities, sometimes they're Black, sometimes they're brown, sometimes they're indigenous, sometimes they're poor. They are all disenfranchised, and they are all, in the context that we're talking about, living on the front lines of industries that pollute. It might be a coal ash heap. It might be a wastewater treatment facility that doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. It can be any number of things. And so that is part of the challenge of the bill is how do we empower these communities with such different views and different challenges to remedy their problems. And so Raul and I listened for over a year and a half as folks came to Washington, as we would talk to people by Zoom and other methods of talking long distance in person. And we listened to what they had to say. And we came up with, and based on what they said, we cobbled together a bill. So we didn't write this bill. This bill was written by the people, for the people. And it does a couple of three things. One, it requires under NEPA for there to be meaningful consultation between the federal government and these communities before the federal government makes a decision as to what's going to happen in a particular area. It calls for us to look at cumulative effects. You know, so oftentimes when we put a cite a project in a particular neighborhood, we look at what that one project, as if it's in a silo, what that's going to do to the community in terms of pollution. But what we don't do is we don't look at the total effect of everything that's going on there, right? They might have plant A that does X, and they might have plant B that does Y, and they might have plant C that does Z. And together it's an untenable situation. And so what we require is that the cumulative effect be taken into account before another frontline polluter is cited in a particular area. And then also what we do is we give folks the common sense right under the Civil Rights Act to enforce these laws for themselves. They don't have to wait for a state actor. They can go to court and sue and tell the court they don't have clean air, that they don't have clean water, that that's a civil right, and move forward accordingly. So what we believe we've done with their help and quite frankly, their guidance, what we believe they've done is help us craft a bill that empowers these communities, that respects the fact that they're all different, but that they all have one common challenge, and that is to be able to have clean water and clean air. And we know that that affects Black and Brown and indigenous communities and the poor much differently in a COVID environment than it does the rest of America. Because it's already weakened our immune systems, because it's already put us in areas where we're physical situations where our immune systems are compromised. You see a disaster happening, right? I mean, you've read the reports, you understand that in Hispanic communities, as well as African American communities, as well as tribal communities, that the effect of COVID-19 has been drastically out of proportion to how it affects the rest of the country. And that is in large measure why. It's because of where we live, the water we're exposed to, the air that we inhale. And so it's our hope that we'll be able to move forward. It's been wonderful working with Kathy. She was beautiful in making sure that environmental justice was a centerpiece of the plan that we rolled out that she referred to. I'm also happy to tell you that the Biden plan takes much of what the CASTOR plan had in it and adopts it and puts environmental justice at the center of that plan as well. So I have great hope for the future as we get ready to go into the 117th Congress, that we'll be able to do some really positive things in the area of environmental justice and move this country forward to make sure that environmental justice doesn't just apply to the wealthy, but it applies to all. And now I have the pleasure of yielding to my good friend and my seatmate on Energy and Commerce, and just a wonderful advocate for all people in America, but particularly those who are struggling to make ends meet, none other than Congresswoman NANETTE BARRAGÁN.
Well, thank you so much for that, Donald. Thank you for all your work and your leadership. Thank you, Chair CASTOR, for all your work and your leadership, and the House Democratic Caucus for holding this important conversation on environmental justice, COVID-19, and what it means for Latinos as we wrap up Hispanic Heritage Month. As Donald just said, this impacts communities of color in general, and Latino, African American, indigenous communities, certainly poor. And so critical conversation. For far too long, Latinos have faced a disproportionate burden from pollution. We have been left behind. Americans' environmental laws and programs that are meant to protect and clean up communities, which is why it's so important that we're having this conversation. My very own district, South LA, California's 44th district, which is over 70% Latino. We're surrounded by 3 freeways, the Port of Los Angeles. We have urban drilling, oil refineries, commercial ports, as I mentioned. And the drilling is happening right in people's backyards. So it's great to hear Representative McEACHIN talking about the cumulative impacts, because when you talk about that, you see in my very own district, the harm that it has caused. Now, we know that in Southern California, we have some of the worst quality of air in the country, right? And that's also being linked now to greater deaths, greater respiratory issues. In my district, it's far too common. You can go to a local park and you see a kid that will walk around with inhalers around their necks. Why? Because the doctor's offices pile them up, expecting children to have to come and get one because of the air quality. And so what we have is we have more Latino children, almost 40% Latino children who are more likely to die from asthma than white children. That's unacceptable. We also know that Latinos are facing higher rates of respiratory diseases from air pollution, which is making them more vulnerable to COVID-19. Now, it's an environmental injustice. It's combined with economic and public health inequities. And that has unfortunately led Latinos in my district and throughout California and the country from being disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And we also know that many Latino workers are on the front lines during the pandemic. They're essential workers. They have to go back to work. They're first to go back. right? And sometimes they lack access to PPE, test swabs, other vital supplies have also been a challenge here in South LA. And so overall, the impact to Latinos of COVID-19 combined with the environmental injustice has been enormous and has been disproportionate. And so the pandemic has done one thing, and it has been able to highlight these inequities, these racial inequities across the country that Congress can no longer ignore. So we need solutions. What do we need to do? Well, when we rebuild our economy from this pandemic, Latinos can't afford to return to the normal. That relies that the normal has been relying upon things like the fossil fuel economy and inadequate environmental protections. Like, we need a bold green stimulus focused on equity, stronger environmental standards, and to hold polluters accountable rather than provide them with tax breaks. That's why we need at least a green stimulus of $2 trillion that's going to prioritize investments in clean energy and sustainable infrastructure programs in communities of color. Now, one of the things the House Democrats was just able to do, proud we were able to get it passed, was the Moving Forward Act, the infrastructure bill we just passed. It had several critical provisions in it around clean energy and green transportation. That's an important first step in this recovery and an important first step in moving toward a bold green stimulus agenda. Now, in that legislation, we wanted to make sure that ports across the country were included, that communities that live around ports had resources and the ability to clean the ports across the country. So my bill, the Climate Smart Ports Act, was included in the infrastructure bill. It invests in zero emissions technology to clean up our ports. Now, ports are job creators, and that's fantastic, but they're also major polluters. And so we need to invest in our communities. Nearly 70% of Americans live within 3 miles of a port. Think about that for a moment, the huge impact that we're having from pollution. Now compound on that the traffic nearby, the oil refineries, and all of that. So we also need to make sure that we're focusing on equity. We need to prioritize our minority-owned businesses, small businesses in these investments. For example, right now we have almost 90% of the solar industry's CEOs are white, and over 80% are men. So our clean energy investment should support jobs and wealth creation in the Latino community. And so thank you so much for holding this very, very important conversation. We need to act boldly. And frankly, this is a public health crisis. And so with that, it is my honor to introduce my colleague, an emergency room physician right here from California, Congressman Dr. Raul Ruiz.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Representative Barragán. I'm a fellow Energy and Commerce Committee member with Chair CASTOR and Representative MCEACHIN. I'm the Vice Chair of the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee of that committee. So I really want to thank Chair CASTOR and Representative MCEACHIN for your hard work as part of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and for hosting this very important conversation. My name is Congressman Dr. Raul Ruiz. I'm an emergency medicine physician, a public health expert trained in disaster humanitarian aid, and I represent California's 36th Congressional District in Southern California, Eastern Riverside County, home of the Coachella Music Festival, which includes the Coachella Valley where I grew up. Environmental injustice has long played a huge role in widening health inequalities among certain demographics and economic classes in our country: rural, poor, Latino, African American, Native American. From airborne hazards to contaminated drinking water, polluted resources are known to worsen health outcomes, disproportionately harming underserved, resource-poor communities, communities of color. When a public health crisis hits, who sees the most infection, the greatest transmission rates, who tragically sees the highest death rates? So as a physician, I want to talk to you about how environmental justice communities and their heightened exposure to toxins increase underlying pulmonary illnesses and therefore increased risk of dying from COVID-19. And let's start with the science and also with the medicine. Consider the fact that COVID-19 is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily a respiratory illness that severely impacts lung function. Let's also note that those that are at most risk of dying from COVID-19 have underlying illnesses. We have huge health disparities in our country that have plagued Latinos, African Americans, and other minorities due to systemic failures, not only in the healthcare delivery system, but also with environmental justice issues where pollution is mostly concentrated in communities of colors, whether that be from, like in my home district with farm workers, underdeveloped areas where dust is more exposed, or a neglected Salton Sea, which is a large body of lake that's receding, and the dust particles entering into the air, whether it's historically the use of pesticides near farm worker communities, or even as recently as toxins coming from companies that have caught on fire, this mulch company, for example, or others that that really affect the children's nearby, or even contaminated water, where we have a high dose concentration of arsenic and selenium and other toxic metals, not only in the dust but in the water. So already this area in Southern California with farm worker kids, they have the highest pediatric asthma hospitalization rate in the country. We know that life expectancy is less in African American, Latino communities that live in dense, urban, polluted environments. We know that oftentimes permits are made for companies that want to do business in areas that have disempowered communities, poor, resource poor areas. So this is the interplay between environmental injustice, which is a social determinant of health, with healthcare access, and currently with COVID-19. So Latinos have been ravaged by COVID-19. In California, they represent 70% of the deaths, yet only 46% of the population. In my district, the Eastern Coachella Valley, where farm workers live, or the Coachella Valley in general, where the vast majority of the infections are coming from the Eastern Coachella Valley, represent 30% of the deaths in Riverside County, even though they're only 18% of the population. And it's multifactorial. You have Latinos who are employed in high-risk essential jobs, grocery stores, folks that are picking our fruits and vegetables, farm workers, or people that work in packing houses that don't have the opportunity to simply work from home and be isolated. Then you have, if they do get infected, they're at highest risk of transmitting it to their family or others, because when they go home, they often have inadequate shelter or space, and oftentimes have 3 generations living in a 2-bedroom apartment, 2-bedroom home, and they cannot self-quarantine or self-isolate in a basement or in an attic or in their own separate room. And they're at highest risk of being under-resourced, with less amount of testing, contact tracing, quarantining capacity. And they're at most risk of dying from COVID-19 because of the aforementioned reasons of having a high rate of underlying illnesses. So in the report prepared by the Select Committee on Climate Crisis, they highlighted ways that we can and should move forward and achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, guided by pillars such as investing in disproportionately exposed communities to cut pollution and advance environmental justice. We absolutely need to invest in newer technology that will reduce our carbon emissions, not only in factories and vehicles, but also in the production of renewable energy. That's why I'm glad to see that Congressman McEachin is here and has worked so hard in this environmental justice realm, and that we work together in producing the Environmental Justice COVID-19 Act, which passed the House as part of the HEROES Act and includes tangible ways to address these injustices and empower EJ communities by strengthening protections for vulnerable populations, empowering impacted communities to hold big corporations and government accountable, and providing needed funds to mitigate and prevent future instances of environmental injustices. So these are essential tools for communities and officials to combat the environmental injustices that plague their neighborhoods. It's also why I introduced the Environmental Justice Act of 2019 with Senator Booker, the most comprehensive bill to date to address environmental injustices by requiring federal agencies to consider and mitigate environmental justice impacts, including cumulative impacts of agency actions, and strengthen legal protections for those affected by environmental injustices. The bottom line is that underserved communities and communities of color who face environmental injustices have been hit harder by the coronavirus, and they need essential resources to fight back and prevent the continued environmental abuse. There is a moral imperative to helping these communities, and there is also a practical reason to this pandemic will never be under control in our country if it's not under control in every community. Put simply, each of our health is intertwined. And we need policies that put people's health, safety, and well-being first to pull ourselves out of this pandemic, address healthcare disparities, and create a healthier America for everyone, regardless of zip code, race, or status. You see, the biggest problem with environmental injustice is that the communities that are mostly affected do not have a say in the decisions that are being made that produce the pollution to begin with. So the communities need to be empowered with technical assistance, with funds, with resources, in order for them to be at the table and have a say for the decisions that are made that may affect their water, their air, and their health for sure. So we need to really make sure that they have a seat at the table. So I really want to thank everybody. And in closing, I want to now turn it over to Representative Veronica Escobar from Texas 16th District. She represents El Paso.
And see me. Really want to thank Chairwoman CASTOR for her leadership, as well as Representative MCEACHIN for everything that they've done to make sure that we are doing absolutely everything possible to address this climate emergency and to acknowledge the injustices and the inequities that already exist. You know, in many ways, when you take a step back and you look at the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on minority communities, an impact that has been laid out by my colleagues who spoke before me, it is a very profoundly disproportionate impact that minority communities like Latinos and African Americans face. The same is true when it comes to the climate emergency. And as we take a look at the climate crisis before us, the impact, the disproportionate impact it's having on communities of color like Latino communities is also very profound. And we know that research demonstrates that those who can least afford to live comfortably, meaning with air conditioning, for example, in very hot, arid, dry places, or very hot, humid places, or heating in very cold places, those are the folks who can't access those services that keep them safe and that keep them healthy. The impact on the poor is profound, and the impact on minorities is profound as well. You know, the other thing, and my colleague, Congresswoman Barragán, mentioned ports in her statement. I want to give you an example of what a community like mine, 80% Latino on the US-Mexico border, in the middle of the Chihuahuan Desert, what we are facing in terms of economic injustice and environmental injustice. We are so proud of our multiple land ports of entry that are key lifelines, not just to our local and state economy, but to the national economy as well. When the Trump administration, for example, decides to slow down traffic at our ports of entry, what you see is not people making the decision to not use the ports of entry. You just see miles and miles and miles of cars that are idling, waiting to go back and forth in what is a very interconnected binational community. And of course, what that means when we have miles of idling vehicles, that means that we have far more air pollution. Our ports of entry, most of them are located adjacent to some of the poorest communities, some of the poorest zip codes in the country. And so these are the families that are having to breathe that air and who are having to deal with the health consequences of what's happening in the environment around them. And as we know full well, the lack of access to health insurance and quality health care compounds that problem. We need a whole of government approach that isn't just the federal government, but that includes the state government and the local government. This approach also needs to be about more than government. It needs to include the private sector, and it needs to include every single person that as an individual. That is the only way that we are going to address the climate crisis. I'm very proud of the work that we are doing in my district to make sure that we are including our constituents, we're including El Pasoans in those conversations. My district office, I'm very proud of the fact that I've held town hall meetings specific to this issue so that our community can have those important conversations, not just about the policies that need to be enacted, not just about envisioning what we can be and what we should be. For example, El Paso can and should be leading the way in solar energy when we have more than 360 days a year of sunshine. But it also is about giving individuals the tools that they need. Number one, to change things around them, but number two, to also change internally. One of my town hall meetings, for example, focused on what each one of us can do as an individual to limit our carbon footprint. We had another town hall meeting as another example about water, living in the desert and in the Chihuahuan desert. And as we see longer, hotter seasons, summer seasons, and as we see records being broken in terms of heat, triple-digit heat, and as we see increased drought, obviously our very precious resource of water needs to be conserved. And so it's been really exciting to work with the community on empowering them and giving them the information they need in order to change their consumption habits. Now, again, it's not just about one approach or one facet of the approach, but we also are putting together a climate emergency task force because we want to bring everybody in. Government, the private sector, and create civic engagement and a movement that will help change things. A movement that will also include awareness. You know, I'll give you all another example of something that happened in my community not that long ago in the 1990s, late 1990s. There was an effort to send nuclear waste to our region, nuclear waste from Vermont and from places very far away from here. You know, we've got to make sure that waste that is produced by a community doesn't get shipped off and dumped in another community simply because they're poorer and may not be as civically engaged. So for me, our climate task force is very much about not just creating that change through policy and practice, but also empowering people with information and getting them civically engaged in a community that is 80% Latino and that is faces some serious economic challenges. Lastly, I want to say that I'm very, very proud of the work that the House majority is doing in Congress. I'm very, very proud of the work that our leaders on the Select Committee have done to put together such a critical work product that is a guide and a roadmap for all of us. my view is that every single committee in Congress, as we talk about federal legislation and federal changes, that we look at the role of every single committee and the positive change that it can bring about. And I'll give you an example. I serve on the House Armed Services Committee, and we know that our military installations, in addition to obviously being so important to our national defense and our readiness and our the ability for us to be a global leader in terms of defense and diplomacy as well. But our military installations are also really problematic in terms of our carbon footprint. And so I've been so pleased to work with some of my House Armed Services Committee members on aspects of the National Defense Authorization Act that essentially create a greener, more sustainable pathway for our military installations, where we think about resiliency and we think about the way that we lead the country in terms of sustainability. I was really proud to sponsor the Department of Defense Climate Resiliency and Readiness Act to ensure that one of the largest producers of greenhouse gases, our military installations and the Department of Defense, prioritizes necessary developments in renewable technologies, that we build on the success of net zero pilots, and that we make judicious use of taxpayer dollars. I'm so proud that that my bill was included in the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis Report. And I think that as we look at every avenue possible to address this climate emergency that we're facing, we've got to use every single tool at our disposal, from major responses that are bold and visionary at the federal level to working in our districts to make sure that people are empowered with information that will help fuel and create that change. And so that Latino communities like mine, minority communities across the country, understand what environmental injustice looks like and can combat it alongside with us every single day. So with that, I will wrap up my contributions to this conversation, and I'm looking forward to our Q&A.
Well, thanks everybody for moving forward on this. Great comments. I wanted to ask you all just what Congresswoman Escobar said. We've got to empower communities across the country. Many communities that have suffered environmental racism have long carried the burden of that toxic waste dump cited in the same neighborhood over and over again. How do you all propose that we empower the community so that they have a seat at the table and they're able to capture a lot of the federal investments we know we need to make in clean energy and in greater resilience?
Congressman, do you want to go first?
I'll take a shot at it. Obviously, I'm biased because of the Environmental Justice for All Act, which contemplates much of what Rep. CASTOR is talking about. For instance, the requirement to have NEPA engage in meaningful conversations with communities before making a particular decision. The notion of cumulative effects, which was so well discussed by both Rep. Barragán and Rep. Escobar. In addition, we give them the avenue to go to court to enforce these rights as if they were, in which indeed they are, a civil right under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But that covers one side of Rep. CASTOR's question. The other side of it talks more about dollars and cents. And that's where we have to invest in the communities. As Dr. Ruiz was speaking to, we've got to have massive investments to give these folks an opportunity to get these new green jobs of the 21st century, whether it's building a windmill or a solar panel, or maybe even starting their own business, start a business in terms of weatherization, start a business in terms of making homes more resilient. There's a plethora of things that can happen if we just give these folks the tools that they need to make their communities better.
And Kathy, if I may, what Donald just mentioned that they did, I think is really key, right? It's when we're drafting legislation, it's meeting with the environmental justice groups, the grassroots folks on the floor, on the ground, because the reality is that that's when our legislation picks up that public sentiment is important and it moves public policy, right? And so when I met with the EJ community early on, they had mentioned to me that they were so grateful for that, but also mentioned they were working with Raul Grijalva and Donald on the EJ for All bill. And so when we did our climate smart sports bill that got into the infrastructure bill, it was because we had done all those conversations in advance to build those coalitions so that we already had labor on board. We had EJ communities on board and so many others, even people in industry who generally would come back and push back on some of this. And so that's the first thing. The other thing we have to recognize, the communities, in particular in my district, people who live near the ports could be vulnerable folks who maybe are afraid to speak up or speak out, especially in this climate where there's so much of an anti-immigrant agenda. I went down to take photos near the oil refineries just to have them in the background one time for a mailer that I did, and the security from the oil companies came out, basically threatening to call the police. Can you just imagine if you are an immigrant and maybe if you're undocumented, like my mother who would say, hey, we're just happy to be here. We don't ask questions. We don't, we don't raise an issue. And so we have to empower those communities so they feel safe to speak up, to have a seat at the table and not be left behind, because we know they are targeted. And we know that's why the polluting industries go into these communities, because they may feel a fear of speaking up, or maybe they're working two jobs and they aren't able to show up like in other wealthy communities. It happened when I represented another part of the country, Hermosa Beach, where very different outcomes. So I've seen what the impact can be in different neighborhoods and the efforts and the fear.
And Kathy, I think, I totally associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues. And, I think that, there's that role in Washington, and then there's that role at home. And when people do feel empowered with information and they know the avenues that they can use and that are most effective in order to create change or to stop something that could be damaging, there's so much power in numbers and there's power in that unity. And that's why for me, there's so much energy on the ground right now around this issue that we've really got to help bring people together and empower them in that way, so that they recognize what it looks like to be on the receiving end of policies or practices that are damaging to their health and their community. And that then, number two, we give them a role and a seat at the table so that they can begin pushing the community agenda of clean air, clean water, a clean environment. As Representative Barragán mentioned, this includes and is especially true for immigrant communities, like those that we represent, where there has been so much incredible fear stoked, especially over the last 4 years, about using their voice. And so our support and our uplifting of their voice is really critical. And it's always safer for them when there are large numbers and when they are part of a movement and a group. And that, I truly believe, is some of the work that is the most rewarding within the district, is working with those constituencies.
Great points. And one of the action items that we've identified is just plain enforcing the clean water protections and clean air protections that are already on the books. You all might remember the hearing we had a while back with a bipartisan group of former Environmental Protection Agency administrators, all of them to a person appalled at the rollbacks by the Trump administration on our bedrock environmental protections and lack of enforcement. They've completely taken the environmental cops off the beat. So who suffers? It's always going to be the frontline communities, those communities that don't have the lobbyists in Washington, that don't have the voice to speak up, that are working, just trying to get through the day, taking care of their kids. So that's another one. Another point I want to ask you all about is, here we're in the middle of this global pandemic. And here in the United States, because of the Trump administration's chaos and failure to control COVID-19, we have the highest mortality rate out of all the developed countries in the world. When you add climate impacts on top of that, that's a threat multiplier. We know we've got to strengthen the supply chains and improve the public health. So I'd like each of you to identify a few things that you think are tangible to communities across this country that can help tackle COVID, control the coronavirus, and make sure we're doing the right thing when it comes to climate and the air we breathe.
Donald, do you want to give it a shot first?
Well, I feel bad
I'm thinking about your bill and everything it does for our EJ communities and the direct tie it has onto COVID.
Well, go ahead, Nanette. I went first last time.
Okay, so one of the things, first that we need to focus on, I think we know this as a caucus, the House Democrats have been doing this. It's making sure our communities have access to health care and preventive care, right? So there's like this, it's all tied together, right? We don't just clean up the air, we have to provide the access to care for them to be able to see a physician and a doctor. So the first thing is continuing our fight for healthcare access, for the AC, strengthening that, right? And to close this gap on the inequalities, the racial health disparities. Because frankly, if Latinos, for example, and African Americans didn't have those higher rates of respiratory issues, they wouldn't see as high rates of COVID-19. So there has to be the health component as well to the environmental component. I mix them together and call it a public health crisis. So House Democrats' infrastructure bill is a good step in that direction, right? Is investing in green jobs and investing in infrastructure and doing so in a way that's being responsible with the climate. But this is where I go right back to the green stimulus. The COVID-19 has hit us all hard. And when we rebuild, we just can't do it the same old way again. We've got to do it thinking ahead about environmental injustice. It's thinking ahead, so when we're going to invest the dollars, that we're doing so in a way that's going to address the public health crisis, the disparity, and environmental justice. And so I'm just proud to be working with you all, and hopefully, Kathy, all the work you have done with the committee and your report, that we can take tangible first steps on day one under a new administration and new Congress and get working, because the American people want action now. So thank you for all your work. Super appreciate it.
And if I could jump in, and I'll be brief, I think in addition to the health disparities, one of the things that has come up as a major issue in my community is the lack of incentives or hard dollars to transform homes, residential, to invest in residences. There are far too many families in my community, for example, who can't get good air conditioning or don't have great windows to make sure that the AC is working in their home, or that the heat gets retained in their home. Something as simple as that. This is what our families are living with. And as the climate gets more extreme, as it gets colder, as it gets hotter, and you look at COVID, for example, as people are stuck in their homes. We had one of the hottest summers on the books in El Paso, Texas this summer, a summer when the vast majority of our families could not leave their homes. And I cannot tell you the desperation that many of my low-income families have felt without being able to have climate control within their own home. So robust incentives for residential, especially low-income families, but also we need incentives for all of the old facilities, old buildings that exist across the country, especially in poorer communities so that they are not energy wasters, but energy conservers and help the climate.
You know, Kathy, I think Reps Barragan and Escobar have said it all. So I'll just add this. To those folks who are viewing us today and in the days to come, make sure you communicate to your policymakers, whether state, local, or federal, how important the issue of environmental justice is, and how important it is that we really cannot solve the climate crisis without solving environmental justice issues. We're here, the four of us plus a whole Democratic caucus in Washington is here ready to put our shoulders to the wheel. And again, to all of you all, thank you. And to Rep. CASTOR, wherever you go, I'll follow. You just lead us the way.
Well, our task is urgent. Folks in Washington have delayed the urgent action that we need for far too long. And now we really do have an ambitious task ahead. But we have the solutions. We have the smart ideas from folks like Rep. McEachin and Rep. Barragan and Rep. Escobar and Rep. Dr. Ruiz. I've seen them in action. Our Solving the Climate Crisis report is an ambitious, sweeping policy proposal that will reduce carbon pollution, and it is built upon a foundation of environmental justice and fair labor standards for workers. We know we've got to improve the public health while we tackle the climate crisis. So go to our report at house.climatecrisis.gov. Check it out. This is our roadmap forward. And with your help, we'll be able to tackle the climate crisis and develop those tangible solutions that each of my colleagues have talked about here today. So thank you very much for joining us. As Rep. McEachin said, contact your member of Congress, contact policymakers at all levels. We're your voice and we want action now. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.